Dithda hadina pabuni, the bocasto MESKLA Brewyon Drudh, Ostis Genev Sove Berryman. Hello and welcome everyone to the MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcasts, hosted by me, Sove Berryman. MESKLA Brewyon Drudh is a multi-platform project using sculpture making and conversation to explore contemporary Cornish cultural identity. Through workshops, podcasts, a symposium and an exhibition, the project invites people to share their experiences of identity and Cornwall, and their views on Cornish culture and its relationship to land, language, heritage, tourism, the Cornish diaspora and much, much more. These podcasts record conversations with guests whose research or lived experience touches on the project themes. The views, thoughts and opinions expressed are the speaker's own. All conversations are carried out with a spirit of generosity and openness, creating space for the discussions to twist and turn. And I'm very grateful to all who have taken part. In this sixth podcast, I'm joined by Dave Beech, an artist and writer from a working class background. He is reader in Art and Marxism at University of the Arts London, and he is author of the books Art and Labour, Art and Postcapitalism, and Art and Value. Beech worked in the collective Freee with Andy Hewitt and Mel Jordan between 2004 and 2018, and has recently had solo exhibitions at Une Gallery New Orleans, Loft 8 Gallery Vienna and Exeter Phoenix, Devon. We join the conversation with Dave introducing his art and writing practices.
Okay, so there are two things that I'm working on at the moment, which might be related. So one is I'm writing a book called Art and Class, and this is as part of my thinking around this, I've been kind of looking at the way that the working class has been represented culturally, both in artworks but also in the literature on culture. And one of the things that might come out of that in our discussion is the relationship between the urban working class and the rural working class, and of different kinds of relations to modernity and relations to technology and so on, and fantasies around the working class and the fantasies around work and fantasies around different kinds of organisation of work, so that's one thing that comes through that study of the literature, and the other thing is that I'm an artist, and I make photo based artworks without a camera because I use books. So my process isn't to take a camera out onto the streets and photograph things. My process is to go to second-hand bookshops and buy books with photos in them that have travelled to me from all over the world. And as you might imagine, quite a lot of photographs are photographs of people doing things that you find in these books. And I'm really interested in this sort of very strange. What you end up with is a very strange collection of images of different people doing things, which I've stacked up in my studio, kind of images of people in various places around the world. Maybe looking at the camera or looking at some object that they've made or that they're selling or something like that, and I'm really interested in these encounters that are then being, in a sense, kind of transported to me. So in a sense, you've got, in the history of photography, what you have generally is photographers leaving their house to go somewhere else to take a photograph of something, But in my case, what I do is I stay put and allow these photographs to come to me from all over the world. And then I rearrange them into montages that kind of tell stories about relations between people in different places. So those, the things that I kind of pick up by looking at the whole history of photography, then kind of feed into my understanding of what it is that I'm looking at when I'm looking at things in the world. Because in a sense, the world ends up looking like a lot of photographs, because this is what I'm looking at on a day-to-day basis. Is like, well, you know, why do they photograph African people this way and European people that way? And then you kind of get this sense of like, okay, so they relate to their environment in different ways, supposedly. So then you can kind of, you see that replicated in the way that people represent themselves. So I can kind of then deconstruct my experience of the world via my kind of understanding of how photography has shaped how we look at people.
Is this process akin to your writing process?
Yeah. When I write, and I've been told this by other writers that have given me feedback on my writing at certain stages in writing the books, is I quote too much. Why can't you just summarise what people say? And I'm like, well, I want to use their words because the way that they phrase things is part of the investigation, and that carries information. You know, so the way that people talk about things carries information, not just what they said. So if I summarise it, then I'm losing information. And so quoting and in a sense building a book out of quotes is part of my writing practice, and then building images out of other people's images is part of my artistic practice. And you know, when I wrote Art and Value, the initial idea for that was to go through the entire history of economics and just identify the points at which economists have mentioned art, and just cut out those quotes and then contextualise them. And effectively that's what I do with the history of photography as well. Yeah.
So within both those practices, there is a very analogue or manual sort of way of working. And this is something we've spoken about before, and I kind of mentioned to you before we started speaking today around a notion of hands working, and is that connected in your research or view to certain identities or cultures, or would you expand upon that a little for me, please?
As soon as we start to talk about hands, I kind of like, there's all these red flags around it. So whilst I have a very particular interest and commitment to working with my hands, you know, sometimes working with my hands just looks like this, you know. I'm using my hands to flick through the book, and it's like that's me doing something manual, as opposed to maybe doing a Google image search for something, you know. So it's like so there's this physical thing in my room which is me with a book, and that's got a kind of charge for me. It relates me to the world in a particular way, which doing a Google search doesn't, or rather the Google search relates to the world in a different way. And so whilst I'm really, there's a commitment for me to working with physical books, but I'm really worried that if I just say that in a very casual way, that it could be read as me having a very romantic attitude towards the handmade or something like that, or maybe even worse than a romantic attitude to the handmade, with a commitment to the handmade as a form of luxury or something like that. So the hand is important in some respects, but I've always got to be very careful not to allow that to be conflated with other conceptions of the hand.
Yeah, and there's so much around that, for instance, in like, well, this is my interpretation of it, like thinking around now farmers markets and such like, and wanting vegetables with mud on them, or you know, it's even in, you know, my lifetime, which is sort of medium long and short, has it was just normal to have markets that sold vegetables, and then they sort of disappeared, and then they came back, but sort of at escalated prices and selling something more than just carrots. There's totally lifestyle purchasing going on there. Is it fetishized?
I think that the hand itself has become a kind of fetish. So you know, this idea of being hands-on, or of doing something with your hands as a way of, in a sense, reconnecting yourself with a world that you don't belong to. So, you know, going to the farmer's market yourself and being what you want when you go to the farmer's market is to be face to face with a farmer. You know, so you don't want to send an intermediary to do the shopping for you, and you don't want the farmer to send an intermediary to do the selling for them. You want, in a sense, to shake the hand of the farmer, even if that shake is really just you handing over money and them taking the money and giving you some vegetables. That contact, which is really signified by the idea of a handshake, or the idea of a kind of an exchange of money in one hand and product in the other, is a kind of fetish for a certain kind of like a corrective to a problem in the world, a corrective to a problem in your life, a sense that maybe, you know, in the mid 20th century, you would use the language of alienation. You'd say you feel alienated from the land, you feel alienated from from the poor, you feel alienated from nature, and so on and so forth. And so what you do is you cure that alienation by, I don't know, befriending the community of farmers or something like that. And so you recognize this loss of connection, and then you create a different kind of connection. You don't actually become a farmer or work with farmers or live with farmers. You create a different kind of connection, which you then can imagine solves the problem that you otherwise feel.
Perhaps the fetish in that is around honesty, or a notion of honesty, or a notion of the authentic connection that is actually a performance.
Yeah. So in my Marxist way of thinking about it, what you have is a problem that's a social relation, and you cure it with an activity. So that's where the fetish comes in. You think that you can I don't know, you can retain all of your privileges, and you can retain all your luxuries, but they can all be compensated by a gesture. And so you can do that gesture, like with the I want to go to the farmer's market and I support farmers, and you know, you can have this kind of ethics of going to a farmer's market rather than a supermarket or something like that. And so you've got this kind of gestural solution to an ingrained structural, historical, social problem. But every time you go to the farmer's market, you're doing your bit, you know, so there's this kind of gestural aspect to it. But you can also do this in relation to yourself. So you can do it in relation to farmers or to workers in some way, but you can also do it in relation to yourself. And you can say, you know, I work in an office, or I don't work at all, or, you know, I have this luxurious lifestyle, but I compensate for this because I also, I don't know, I work 1 day a week for the food bank, you know, or I grow my own vegetables, you know, so I'm not completely sort of cut off from the land and cut off from that kind of that life of need and nature and so on, and there's a kind of self gesturing where you have this one little aspect of your life which you do as a way of compensating for everything else in your life. So one of the ways that this is done in the art world, for instance, is you have this performative relationship to cooking together. So you say, you know, what we're going to do is we're going to have this 12-month project with artists and this local community, and what we're going to do is we're going to start by cooking together and eating together, and this is going to be our way of you know, not being intellectuals, not there's no difference between an artist and an audience member if what you're doing is chopping onions. And so you have this kind of this idea that praxis can solve social relations, because at the moment when you're practicing something, those social relations become invisible. But their being invisible doesn't actually make them no longer existent. So that's what I mean by when I say that it's gestural, is that we can put it to one side for the time being. So it's a formal equality that we're all cutting onions in the same way, when in fact our reasons for being in that place, and sometimes our social relations to that place, you know, for instance, one being employed to be there, the artist, and the other not being employed to be there, the member of the public, are very, very different. But those things also become invisible when you're doing praxis together, when you're doing something with an audience, which is practical rather than I don't know, theoretical or aesthetic or something like that.
So there's something, I mean, it seems like there's something in all those activities that is around, like whether it be the artist doing the sort of Greek cooking like you suggest, or like the shopper at the farmer's market, or the volunteer, a community project, or the food bank, a charity setting. That there's something there about seeking reconnection, or, I mean, I suppose I'm sort of, because you use the word around compensation, which is easy, I think, to hear as a negative. Oh, you know, so this is someone who's knowing, but is there also potentially something in there around a genuine, like, seeking to connect with something more manual?
Okay, so here's where I'm going to say no, right? And I'm going to give a different example now, just to kind of illustrate the kinds of problems that I'm looking into and thinking about all the time. So if we think about travel, okay, and the difference between working class travel and middle class travel. All right, so there's this amazing book by Michael John Law called A World Away, and it's about the invention of the package holiday, and basically the invention of what we would now kind of pejoratively call tourism, as opposed to genuine travel. You know, genuine travel. There's another really interesting book by Emily Thomas called The Meaning of Travel. I'm interested in travel because of my interest in the history of photography, because photographers travel, and quite often what we want from the photograph is that the photographer is genuinely gone somewhere and had a genuine encounter with something that is remote to us, and they photograph it, and then we get to, in a sense, experience something of that real travel, not just a tourist experience, but real travel through the photograph. And so I'm really interested in different theories of travel. And one of the things that is that comes through every study of travel, so Emily Thomas has looked at, when she talks about the meaning of travel, she's looked at the way that philosophers have written about travel, and the way that Michael John Law talks about travel is he's actually looked at the industry itself, the tourist industry, and the difference between when you have middle class people initially going on foreign holidays, and working class people don't go on foreign holidays. So going to a foreign place is a genuine experience of another culture. All right. And then when working class people start to do the same thing, then you're going to have to do something extra to have a genuine experience of a foreign culture that's not the same as a working class experience of going to a foreign place. And so you have to go, effectively, this goes back to the hands idea, effectively, you're going to have to organise this yourself. In other words, you're going to have a hands-on relationship to your own holiday, whereas the working class will go on holidays that are packaged for them by a company. And so you're going to have to, so it becomes like more about sort of wandering around a foreign country and trying to go somewhere that you would not have planned to go to, and that's genuine travel. And the way that Emily Thomas talks about genuine travel as opposed to tourism is there's increased levels of alterity, there's increased levels of otherness. The more otherness you get into your journey, the more genuine this is, and therefore the more authentic your experience has been. Whereas the idea of working class foreign travel is that you go to Spain and you have fish and chips, and then you go to a British or an Irish pub. And so the idea, the negative picture of working class travel is that you're going somewhere else, but you're getting exactly the same as what you would have had if you'd have stayed. There's zero alterity, zero otherness. So this is not genuine travel. And what you then see in the as a pattern is this designation of a certain class to a certain kind of activity. So what's really interesting that comes out of Michael John Law's book On a World Away is when package holidays first started, they were described as being very working class kinds of holidays, but actually subsequently, when historians have looked at the data, most of the people that went on them were middle class, but they were assigned a kind of working class characteristic because they were packaged, because they were commercial, and because a minority of the middle class had already rejected that and had then started to have these more genuine, more authentic experiences of foreign places, of more out of the way places. So one of the way of doing that is to go to other countries that had not been traditional holiday destinations for the British, for instance. And another way of doing it is to go to more remote places within countries that people had traditionally gone to. And another way of doing it is to organise it yourself and to do your research before you go and all of that kind of thing. So it's like it becomes a kind of craft. You are crafting your own holiday, whereas the package holiday is industrialized, and so you kind of have, in a sense, this kind of a sort of William Morris ethic of the holiday, which even if you're so in a sense, even if you're middle class, you can end up having a working class experience, but what, because you've gone on this industrial holiday or industrialized holiday, and so you get this kind of crafting of a holiday which makes you oddly middle class. So historically you would say that craft is a working class activity, but when you craft your own life, that's a middle class activity. And the crafting then becomes, and this is what I think makes it, this is why I think you were right to say that the hand becomes fetishized, because crafting becomes fetishized insofar as it becomes a within a, you know, so long as craft isn't what you do for a living, then crafting becomes very middle class. Whereas when you craft for a living, then it's not middle class. So you get these. So another thing that I'm really interested in is food and cooking and things like that. So what that means is that you could do exactly the same thing as somebody else, and when you do it as a middle class person, that's crafting, and when somebody else does it, it's just work. So you know, you can fetishize the degree to which, when you cook dinner, you're crafting your life and you're expressing yourself and you're objectifying yourself and you're being fulfilled and so on and so forth, and you're doing the right thing and all of these things. But when somebody else does exactly the same activity, they're showing just how much they are they're not living their own life. They're alienated from their own life because they're cooking something for somebody else. And so all of these kind of patterns of differentiation are expressed in the various ways in which we pat ourselves on the back or we sneer at other people through doing, in some cases, exactly the same thing.
Just going back to the tourism point, I mean, it seems to me that this is where tourism, well, an aspect of where tourism is connected to colonial activity, and this sort of and the romanticising of the explorer. It also seems to me that behaviour has equally, or if not more, impactful impact upon the place, the touristic destination, and the people and culture that is becoming that tourist destination.
So one of the I think you're right that, especially historically, so in Emily Thomas's book, there's a really interesting relationship between the kind of the philosophical idea of travel and colonialism and settlement and so on. But one of the really interesting developments is that in the late 20th century and in the 21st century, certain colonialist patterns become the solution to the problem of tourism. So for instance, the idea of working for a charity for a year or so becomes associated with like genuine travel, because you have, you know, you go and maybe work alongside people from another culture, people in many cases people of a different race, and you spend real time with them, and so that colonial relationship then feels to, or at least it's written about as being more genuine, more authentic, more real than than Brits going to Spain and getting a suntan, you know, and so there's been a kind of maybe there's been a kind of blindness towards how much that reintroduces the colonial relationship into our desire for an authentic experience of the other. That the desire for otherness that Emily Thomas talks about then becomes, you know, more and more intensified, so that the only way you can really get it is to actually go and live in another community, and in some cases that then becomes less about holidaying, and perhaps becomes work. So, you know, the only way to really seriously experience the other is to get a job working in another country. And so you're paid to go and work with people who are other, and that becomes even more genuine, even more authentic than somebody just taking a year out. So yeah, so it's, you would think, I don't know, well, I would think anyway, that this whole experience of colonialism would have made would have made us very conscious and very alert and very concerned about those relationships. But actually, in studies by sociologists of people going on gap year breaks to work for charities and so forth, shows that actually there's very little trace of that perception of that being a concern, but more of like that this was an experience that improved me, that made me better, that made me more authentic, that made me understand the world better.
So connecting that to objects and the tourism memento, but also expanding upon that into lifestyle mementos, and adoption of life, I suppose what I'm trying to say is like potentially turning what is perceived as somebody of an other lifestyle or a fetishized lifestyle, it becoming a product that can be purchased and put on. Yeah, and that feels like an extension to this tourism conversation.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I've written about this, and it's very I don't know. There's lots of ways that it feels very intricate to me, the way that things have been transposed, the way that things are substituted for each other. So for instance, you in the 18th century, there arises this idea that philosophically, a human being becomes authentic when they make a world that represents their subjectivity out of them. So you know, like making things, you know, making things is an expression of who you are, and then when you recognize yourself in the world, then you're at home in it. It's a world that you've made, and you've made it in your own image according to your subjectivity, and so on and so forth. And that's the theory. But actually, when it's applied to especially middle class urban life at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, it takes on a slightly different form, which is you express yourself, you become more authentic when you buy things that express your taste. So this is where that whole kind of concept of taste comes from, and taste becomes this way of seeing yourself in a world and having the world reflect back to you, and therefore in a sense of you of the inner world becoming an outer world and the outer world becoming an inner world, of these things being completely sort of at one with each other, but now through purchase, not through making. And what you get then in the early 19th century is this sense, and especially with the rise of industrialization, where the person who buys the products expresses themselves and is authentic through that purchase, but the people that made it are not expressing themselves. They don't become authentic by making the things that middle class people want to buy. And then this is extended and transposed into this idea that the indigenous make, let's put it in the most negative way we can, make tourist trinkets that allow the tourist to feel authentic, but where the indigenous producer is producing things for money, so is therefore not having that authentic experience in either in the production of the things or in the sale of the things. There's a double alienation there, because you're alienated from the product because the product's now being taken away from you, but you're also alienated from yourself because you're producing things for the market, for the tourist market. So, yeah, exactly what you were saying.
I was just thinking, and another layer to that is that many tourist trinkets, for want of a better term, that are mass-produced may very well be mass-produced elsewhere in an other place entirely to the place that they are representing. And that so that's that other layer of disassociation, and then there's a hierarchy of tourist trinket. The crafted artisan slice of the tourist memento market, if you like.
Yeah, and so we then have, in a sense, the split between tourism and travel is then, in a sense, marked on the objects themselves, because you have these tourist objects and then the genuine article, which is handmade by local people, and so you get this kind of class split in objects, which follows the contours of this intellectual distinction between tourism and travel. And the ideal situation is that you fill your house with genuine, handmade, locally produced, locally sourced, traditional objects that have that otherness in them, So it's still about that alterity. It's still about making contact with otherness and somehow capturing the otherness, taking the otherness with you, but always, I think, of a kind of self-making through the encounter with otherness. So the otherness is always an otherness for you. It's not an otherness for the other, because then you'd leave the stuff there. You have to take it with you because the otherness is for you. And it's part of your narrative and your crafting of yourself, and you craft yourself through the encounter with otherness.
So can we think now, or perhaps hear you talk a bit about the that otherness from the other's perspective, and that relationship with the objects, the totems of that otherness, yeah.
Well, there's a very straightforward, slightly skeptical, cynical way of thinking about this, but I want to link that to a sort of critique of the romance of the otherness. So the romance of the otherness says the other should only make things that are traditional and indigenous and local, and so on, and so on. The tradition should determine your activity, not the market. You know, as soon as you start making market things, then this isn't what the romance of the other wants. That's from the romance is from the perspective of the visitor. So if you dismantle the romance, then the person producing the artisan goods or the tourist goods is doing that for money. And the problem is you can't simply express that without devaluing the object. And the whole point of it is to produce value. So there's a sense in which you have to sort of go along with the romance to a certain point in order to sell to the people who are subscribing to that romance. But ultimately, if you want to be cynical about this or skeptical about this, you can say that there is no romance for the producer. That the producer knows full well what they're doing when they're making these things in this kind of commercial way, and the difference between the mass market and the artisan market is not just that one is inauthentic and the other is authentic, but that one is low cost or low value and the other is high value. The artisan has got more value, and one of the ways that the artisan gets more value is that it is clothed in romance, not just that it's handmade. The handmade aspect is part of the romance, and it means it takes more time and it's more expensive to produce because it's not made of plastic or something, But it's also about marking the object with that romance. From the perspective of the producer, the romance, you have a kind of conflicted relationship to the romance, because the romance is not your romance, but the romance is part of the value, and therefore is in your discourse around the object, and might be you might need to mark your space and mark your body with this romance as well, So there's this whole kind of apparatus of being ourselves for others, that you have to signify your selfness to others, and signify your otherness to them, and to yourself, and so you end up with this kind of living a kind of romance, or marking your territory with that romance,
and
it's part of the marketing.
And that surely is in itself distancing and creates the opportunity or the situation for a disconnect of place, self, identity.
Yeah, so there's a really famous example of this. So the very first, apparently, this is what I've read, the very first documentary movie of an indigenous person is Nanook of the North, which was made in 1922 by Robert Flaherty. And Nanook of the North is a film about Nanook, and Nanook was not called Nanook. The name is given to him because it feels more authentic. It feels like a proper indigenous name, whereas his actual name didn't feel indigenous enough. And Nanook of the North is a film about whale hunting, and the filmmaker wanted him to hunt with a spear, even though by the time that it's made in the 1920s, they hunted with guns. It's like, that doesn't make the movie that I'm after, so we're going to get you to hunt with a spear for the benefit of the film. So it's like, you know, so there are all these issues around documentary generally, and this is just like one example of it, but this is how an image of the indigenous is projected onto the indigenous. And you know, it's not just an idea. There are real objective forces which are then, in a sense, put onto the indigenous to be really indigenous, you know. And there's this trope that comes out over and over again in contemporary writing on working class culture, for instance, where as soon as you go to college or become successful in a particular field, or you know, you're good at something, music, sport, something like that, when middle class people encounter you, the first thing that they say, and they say it just like it's a pattern, it's like a tick that they can't help saying, is, "You don't seem working class." And so, you know, you speak too articulately to be working class. I wouldn't have guessed that you're working class. You know, you don't dress working class, and all of this kind of thing, because they have this idea of what the working class should look like, should speak like, should act like, and so there's this parallel, I think, with, like, it's not enough just to be indigenous. It's not enough just to be working class. You have to look and act and talk and seem like that, which means you have to conform to a predetermined image. And the image, more than likely, will have been produced decades or longer ago. And so there becomes a kind of temporal element to this. And so the romance of the indigenous and the romance of the working class and the romance of the handmade is always presented as a kind of nostalgia, because the image that we have of it was always produced a generation or two ago.
Thinking about class and place, and yeah, very much that romanticism around, and what I've called before the fetish around class. It's boundaried, and it needs to stay within that boundary, and there can't be these sort of tendrils or shifts or movements.
Yeah, there's this really odd moment. You know, Richard Hogarth, who wrote the Uses of Literacy. Sorry, it's like one of the books that helped to found what we now think of as cultural studies. And Richard Hogarth, who was himself working class and went to university, and then became one of the first people to study the working class as a living culture within his research, and so he's like really important in terms of that resistance to the idea of like what should be studied in university, what counts as proper culture and so forth. But even he said that during his lifetime, the working class have gone from being, you know, people in rags, in slums, with nothing, you know, who were, and he says that when he was growing up, there would, you know, he experienced days without food, or with, you know, with just eating a slice of bread or something like that. So hunger is part of his conception of the working class, because that's what it was when he was young. And then he says, there can't be a working class anymore because the working class have got radios and televisions and they have nice clothes, and they have steady employment, and it's like, as soon as the working class changes its form, it changes its look, and changes, as soon as the working class itself has organised itself to a point where it's forced its employers to give it higher wages, and therefore to have better clothes and better houses and more food, then it's no longer working class. That to me is a really bogus argument, because the working class has improved its conditions, and that does not mean it's no longer working class. It just doesn't look like our image of the working class that we have from the 19th century and from the first 30 years of the 20th century. And the same thing happens with modern rural lifestyles and things like
that. There's something that's coming into my mind here that I can't articulate better than saying what making friends with an experience of being in a place, going to an other, and putting it on and making friends with it and its representatives. Yet still there are very clear lines and boundaries. And again, how I'm interested in how it, from your research and what you speak of, how those other hold on to identity or space. What are the, I don't know, mechanisms of that or behaviours of that, or I haven't got the right words for it, but if you know what I mean.
I don't think I've got the right words for it either, and I don't think I've got a solution for this, because I think what we're experiencing in this period of history is a right-wing ascendancy, a middle-class ascendancy, a white ascendancy, where the struggles of of people who don't live that kind of hegemonic life, their struggles have been marginalised, and we hear a lot from the right about how woke our culture is, because we're interested in diversity and so on and so forth, and diversity has become a kind of ethical necessity. It's demanded of us, but at the same time, this is a perception. Okay, this is a subjective perception. It feels to me as if the diversity is being imposed on the metropolitan centre as something that makes them ethical by acknowledging diversity. All right. So in that sense, you can't be an indigenous rural person with diversity. You're the object of somebody else's diversity. You're not diverse yourself. You are specific, particular, individual. You are of a particular place, of a particular tradition, you're not being asked to become diverse. You're asked to remain identical with images of you. And the same actually is the case for, a working class person who accepts diversity. Then in the literature, and I've read this on more than one occasion, within the literature, as soon as the working class person acknowledges the importance of diversity, they become middle class. So you lose your identity through this acknowledgement of diversity. And some people, in order for that diversity to work, some people have to remain identical with themselves to not benefit from the ethics of diversity. And this is Alain Badiou's theory of ethics. So he says what ethics demands is an other, and the other comes in two forms: the other to save and the other to kill. So, and you basically do both at the same time. And he was saying that what you have to do to be ethical is to identify the evil and identify who you're saving by killing that evil, and then kill them. So you need an other in order to remain ethical. And you need that other not to save itself, but for you to save it. And so that's what I'm basing this on, really, is that kind of idea of ethics. And I think that there's a version of we can apply that, I think, to this idea of identity and diversity, and who gets to be ethically diverse.
This is pushing a bit the bounds of the themes of our conversation, but I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts in connection to this with the term social mobility.
Okay, so social mobility is particularly related, in my reading of the literature anyway, on class, and part of the idea of this really is about denying class. So if you have social mobility, and if social mobility is possible, is potential, then people are not in a class as a matter of the structure of society. They're in a class because they've chosen to be in that class. In other words, if you can say that working class people can work their way out of poverty, or educate themselves out of poverty, and so on. So if you say that every single working class person is capable of becoming middle class, then anyone who's left behind as working class is there of their own volition. It's their own fault. They just didn't work hard enough. They didn't try hard enough. They didn't succeed. And if they tried a little harder, then they could have become middle class. And the idea in the neoliberal idea, but also the idea in America of the underclass, is really the idea that it's entirely their own fault and nobody else is to blame for this. And therefore, they have no right for society to help them out in any way whatsoever. In fact, the more we help them, the less likely they are to try themselves to become middle class.
Can I bring that back around? Social mobility and the tourism conversation and behaviours of colonialism and this boundaries or positioning of otherness, fetish, and who stays in what place. As a to conclude our conversation.
Well, this means, as well as talking about social mobility, we need to talk about mobility itself. And there's in terms of the philosophy of travel, travel is a positive thing. Travel is something that helps you develop as a human being. It's educative. It's enriching. Travel is a form of knowledge. Travel is a form of experience that allows us, like I said before, to craft who we are. And obviously, in order for this to work, some people have to stay where they are because we're travelling to experience that otherness. If they travel to us while we travel to them, then that otherness wouldn't be there. And also, the otherness of travel, clearly, if you look at the literature, doesn't work when people from other places come to the metropolitan centre. That doesn't count. Their otherness, we don't experience their otherness. They experience our otherness. So we don't get the benefit from that. So they have to stay still and we have to travel to them in order for this romance of travel to be realised. And therefore, we have to have this economy of mobility. Some people are very mobile and travel a lot and experience a lot. You know, think about curators versus artists, for instance. You know, or even artists versus publics. You know, there's a differential schema going on where the higher you are, the more travel you have, and the lower you are, the less travel you have. And the people with the least amount of travel are communities who artists visit or curators visit. And the whole point of a community is that they stay still. They're in a place. And so there's this value attached to travel and mobility, which it's a kind of surplus value because it's based on other people being stationary, and they're being fixed in a place is a necessary precondition for anybody else to benefit from travelling. So it's structural.
That so neatly brings us back around to the photograph and the travel photographer. Thank you, Miraz, Dave. And it's been lovely speaking to you, really generous. Thank you.
Lovely speaking to you. Thanks for asking me to do this.
Miraz agus goslowes. Thank you for listening. Further episodes of the MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcast can be found on my website, soveberryman.co.uk. That's soveberryman.co.uk, where you'll also find guest biographies and a resource page of links to further reading on the topics discussed. If you feel inspired to join the MESKLA conversation about contemporary Cornish cultural identity, please get in touch with me, Sove Berryman, via my website or social media. You'll find MESKLA Brewyon Drudh on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. The MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcast and project has been made possible due to a wealth of in-kind help and support from many parties, including the Wenda Perrin Festival, Gorseth Kerne, Cornwall Council's Cornish Language Office, Coethisan Yaeth Canuic, Crescent Kerne, Cornwall Neighbourhoods for Change and Falmouth University Falmouth Campus. The project has been supported using public funding by the National Lottery through Arts Council England, and further funding has been gratefully received from Historic England via Redwreath Unlimited. Agas termen, agas quellas. Thank you for your time. See you later.